Everybody, before we meet on Thursday, I wanted to speak to you a little bit more about procedure planning, but it's interestingly enough, perhaps, I am going to begin by talking about session planning, that is, planning session goals and procedures. And what is the nature? I want to talk a little bit about the nature of session goals. Why am I doing this? Because procedure planning leads us in a significant way to session goal planning, or the planning of session goals and procedures, which are very linked, goals and procedures at the session phase. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at what a session goal is. What is a session goal? We see the session goal as an act of learning leading to the acquisition of behavior targeted as a short-term goal and ultimately the long-term goal. Now the session goal already should be sounding a bit different than the definition of that we've offered concerning long-term and short-term goals, because the session goal is an act of learning, whereas long and short-term goals are relational, the generative relationship-based components of language that, again, that yield functional communication. What are the critical decisions related to session goals? Well, you have to prioritize short-term goals to establish a sequence of session goals to address over the semester. You may have several short-term goals, so we have to decide which short-term goals we are going to address first as we work in session. And we have to create clinician-mediated activities that promote the acts of learning that will lead to the achievement of the targeted short-term goals. What goes on in the session as you're working with the client is hopefully acquisition of something or rehabilitation of something. It's actually an act of learning, an act of rehabilitation. The end product isn't the particular specific session goal. The end product is functional communication as reflected in the short-term and long-term goal. And when we turn to session goals planning more specifically, we will see that another decision that needs to be made is how to identify and control performance demands. That is, the demands upon the client that are made by the non-linguistic context, which is the furniture, the toys, the books, the materials that are presented to the client to work with physically, the materials, and the people standing around as well. Those are the non-linguistic context, the components of the non-linguistic context. The linguistic context is another source of performance demands, the way that the clinician or others in the therapy room interact with the client, the way we speak to the client, respond to the client, and even the language that the client uses surrounding the target behavior itself. All of these aspects of speech, language, and communication represent the linguistic context. So the characteristics of the non-linguistic context, the materials, how the client is positioned, literally the furniture or the floor or wherever the client may be working, all of that represents the linguistic context, everything, the non-linguistic context, everything surrounding the behavior. Whereas the linguistic context is the interaction, the linguistic interaction with the client, the communicative interaction, and even the language the client uses surrounding the target behavior. Now, the design of the non-linguistic and linguistic context, that we call that procedure planning. That's what we do in procedure planning. We create contexts, situations, environments, tasks that the client engages in that promote acquisition or rehabilitation. That's why, by focusing on this idea of the design of linguistic and non-linguistic context as what the session goals are really all about, we see the link between procedure planning and ultimately session goals. Now again, how does a session goal differ from long or short-term goals? A session goal, again, to reiterate, is an act of learning. And an act of learning does not necessarily incorporate generative functional communication. It might, but it might be a task, it might be the acquisition of a skill, a particular specific experience with the world, to promote ultimately the development of the internal representations that will be, and relationships that will underlie functional communication. In contrast, long and short-term goals always reference generative functional communication. A session goal, an act of learning, maybe an act of acquiring a skill, an act of practicing a particular gesture, whatever that might be, that's legitimate. That's a session goal. A long and short-term goal, generative functional relational things. So it's, we provide for you at the end of the session goal chapter templates for writing following to write your session goals. Child will do something observable, given, and you'll describe the non-linguistic context and the linguistic context, and provide a criterion. An example, jumping ahead, remember we're following LC, jumping ahead to LC. These are some examples of session goals for LC. Produce a temporal chain explanatory narrative to describe a recipe for making microwave brownies one time during the session. See, session goals are very specific. LC will produce complex two-verb temporal mans, incorporating before or after to correct the clinician who will attempt to follow a recipe. 8 out of 10 trials. These are examples of session goals. Produce a simile to describe the taste of the brownie. Given the verbal template, it tastes as good as a, or it tastes as bad as a, 3 times during the session. Notice, these are very specific descriptions of very specific acts, observable, measurable acts, in very specific context, describing a specific skill that the client is essentially producing or engaging in. Because we think that by doing these kinds of things, the child will, or the adult, will be acquiring the necessary foundation for achieving the generative long and short-term objectives. Now let's return to procedure planning, because procedure planning, which is all about envisioning the acquisition of the achievement and acquisition of the underlying competencies that permit the long and short-term goals to be realized. Procedure planning, again, very much leads to session goal planning, which again represent acts of learning. Okay. Okay, next you're going to see I want to adjust the picture here. Okay. Okay, next I'm going to show you, present, I think it's a review of the major paradigms about language learning and rehabilitation that provide us with premises about cause and effect relationships that lead to language acquisition, the acquisition or rehabilitation of specific components of speech and language that we may be targeting in our intervention. And those are constructivism, relationship-based pragmatic, scaffolding, social cognitive perspective, and operant paradigms. And these paradigms again give us premises about cause and effect relationship, what leads to acquisition and what gets acquired, by the way, what leads to acquisition and what gets acquired. And we use those premises to derive implications about linguistic and non-linguistic contexts, activities, tasks to present our clients, and ways that we should be interacting with our clients ourselves linguistically and communicatively as clinicians to promote acquisition and rehabilitation. So this is, I think we've done this already, so I'm including it as a review. And then I'll pick up again with the approach to operationalizing the procedural approach that we plan for our clients. And by operationalizing these premises, we take a step closer to creating our session goals and related procedures. So here's the review of the procedural approach, and then we'll turn to the act of operationalizing the approach itself. Okay, I believe in class I was speaking about constructivism to begin with, and I'm going to circle back to that shortly, but I'd like to start here by addressing the social cognitive scaffolding point of view about language learning. And that's the reason I'd like to start here, because I think I'm going to predict, I would anticipate that most of you feel that this is the position, this is pretty much accounts for speech and language acquisition. Now, I did get on the exam on that extra credit question, some other points of view that we'll look at shortly, but this is, I think, the position that most of you come to class with, and that is the premises of social cognitive learning theory is that language emerges from scaffolding. A caregiver or an expert draws a child's attention or an adult's attention. I'm doing it with you, am I not? I'm drawing your attention to objects and relationships and things, and I'm modeling language and problem-solving procedures for you from the point of view that you're going to internalize these things and ultimately use the procedures I present to you, the objects I point out to you, the attributes, the states of the objects, the relationships I point out to you as you talk to yourself through problem-solving situations or through language use itself. And of course you've learned elsewhere, I'm sure, that scaffolding is most effective within the individual's zone of proximal development and within familiar routines. routines are very important for learning. Are they not? We all love routines. Children love routines. We all love routines as we watch our favorite TV shows, and they all pretty much structured the way we expect them to be structured. We go to, I have a routine each evening where I listen to music before I go to bed, or I read the paper. I do the same thing over and over again. In fact, I have a routine of talking about this material over and over again for most of my career. Routine, routine, routine. Scaffolding leads to internalized verbal directives that one uses to talk oneself through problem solving. In other words, scaffolding, as I see it, is very, very directly connected to the level of processing that we have identified as executive functions, the executive level. And this, which is really internal speech that suppresses behavior that it could interfere with achieving something, or with achieving an objective of one sort or another, and directing oneself to the achieving of a directive. So it's through now. I think this. Let's look at we're going to look at an interaction that I had here with actually my son many years ago that illustrates, as I see it, scaffolding. This is in a book reading interaction. So let's take a look at this. Let me click. This should click onto YouTube. A YouTube clip. Here we go. See if that pops up. Here it comes. Let's see if it's the one I'm anticipating. Yeah, here it is.
Where? Oh, look. Who's that? Hi, Emma. Hi, Emma. Brush your teeth, Emma. Bubbles? Where's the bubbles? What are these? Stars. Stars. Oh. Cookie. Where's the star? Oh, top. That's water. Oh, look, Jordan. A button. A button. Hi, Emma. I'm almost reading a book with the stars. Oh, look. Boat, right? A nice boat. Ooh, go to sleep, Emma. Where's the boat? Where's the boat? Where's that boat? Got a boat here? No. Is there a boat here? No. No. Huh? There's the boat. Uh-huh. Oh, where's the moose?
Okay, if you remember in class, I started out as I approached this procedural planning component of the long-term planning phase, the procedural approach component, by addressing constructivism. Again, I have a tendency to gravitate to that often. In any event, I showed you, in fact, a videotape or a recording. We don't say videotape anymore, do we? Although it did come from a tape, a recording of my work a number of years ago with children with autism as I was doing that pulley system intervention there. Uh, Constructivism has been an a major interest of mine over the years. Beginning when I had the insight that, again, language is not about the real world per se, it's about the world as represented in our mind. It then raises the issue that Chomsky said we should all be puzzled about, and I certainly agree with that, the issue of how the world gets into our mind. That was also Piaget's focus in his career, one of his focuses. How do we construct mental representations of the world? Because that's the world we know. The world we know is the world we've created in our mind. And also out of Piaget and Chomsky, this idea that a major component of language and cognition involves relationship making. And relationship making. Sentences are relationships between subjects, objects through actions, or between events, and we discussed that in the Bloom and Leahy content categories. Existence, action, locative action represent these relationships in the semantic area, or causality, epistemic, communication. These are semantic relations that underlie the very sentences that we talk about, the words we generate, about real things in the world that we presume are real, the everyday events. Well, you know, we talk, this is a table. We can talk about the specific object, or we can say, well, this is a table is a relationship between this particular instance of a table and its category. It's a table, as opposed to another piece of furniture, a chair, which itself is a category. And all of those things have to ultimately be linguistic objects. So then the question is, well, how does the world get into the individual's head, and how do these relationships get made, and how do they become more and more complex over time? Well, Bloom addressed that to some extent in her Principles of Development, didn't she? But she herself is a constructivist ultimately, and when we think about procedure planning, again, what does constructivism address? The construction of mental representations and more complex relationships intrinsic to content of mind and semantic relations, syntax, the lexicon, and functions of language. It's also been applied even to phonology. Treatment implications of constructivism. In goal setting, it's legitimate to target functional communication, and that's what we say we should be targeting, right, in the long and short-term goals, and linguistic relations, lexical, semantic, syntactic, and narrative. And those are exactly what we say should be targeted in our long and short-term goals, linguistic relationships, because those are the things that are generative. And generative functional communication is always the end product, the wished for product, the targeted product of intervention. In terms of procedure planning, constructivism leads us to engage clients in goal-directed play with concrete objects, or in goal-directed problem solving involving concrete objects, or both. To encourage, we want to have interactions with our clients to encourage them to communicate to us about their intent, objects being manipulated, problem-solving procedures, and causal explanations for outcomes. And we, clinicians want to comment on the client's focus of attention and interest in real time. It's in this context. It's in context of goal-directed play and problem solving and reflection on that development takes place from a constructivist point of view. Learning and rehabilitation can take place. I would like to show another video clip. This is a more advanced one of my son engaged, my 13-year-old engaged with the Axel task, an Axel task that I created, and relates more closely than the last video that I showed with the involved child with, again, autistic spectrum that we looked at in that pulley system that I was playing around with. This one involves thinking about a procedural and causal event, and relates more to the LC intervention that we were looking at. So in any event, take a look, and then we'll come back and reflect on what we see. Okay, last time in class we spent time talking about designing a procedural approach, which we start thinking about procedures as soon as we establish long-term goals. It's part of the long-term planning phase, and then we continue thinking about procedures at each subsequent phase when we establish short-term goals and session goals, in which at the session level we're actually incorporating the procedures directly into the session goal statement, and we'll explore that further as soon as we get to the session goals. So, and in talking about the establishment of procedures, we recognize that they will need to be evidence-based. So we've already identified two sources of evidence. One is, excuse me, research, clinical research, and the different types of research we discussed, which ultimately includes our own data collection as we conduct our interventions and design them as kind of mini research studies each time we establish goals, set criteria for their achievement, measure the outcomes, etc. We also talked about theoretical perspectives or paradigms that contain premises about how language can be acquired or rehabilitated, or those specific components of speech and language that are being targeted. We talked about constructivist, social, relationship-based pragmatic, behavioral or operant, social learning / scaffolding paradigms, and ultimately motor learning paradigms. So these beliefs systems, supported by clinical research, really underpinning clinical research, provide premises which help us establish, serve as guidelines really, for the establishment of procedures. And recall that procedures are content really about what the clinician does to create contexts in which the client can acquire the competencies that are targeted at the long-term, short-term, and session levels. And we identified the linguistic context and the non-linguistic component of the context, where the linguistic context is the actual speech communication interaction between the client and the caregiver that we design carefully when we engage in procedure planning. It's also the language surrounding the target behavior that in the client, him or herself. The sounds surrounding the target sounds, the sentences within which the fluent client working on fluency is dealing with, etc. That would be the linguistic context. So we carefully design that context. The non-linguistic context is the people, just the actual presence of others, but also the task that the client is engaged in, and the materials that are being used. Are they toys? Is there actual food being manipulated? Concrete objects, in other words, concrete objects. Or are we is the context more symbolic? So it's books, written material, verbal directions, verbal commands. All of these are, the verbal command part would go back to the linguistic context, excuse me. The gestures we use perhaps, but more importantly the specific materials that the client is expected to interact with, which would include written material, whether the client, by the way, is operating at a desk or on the floor, whether there are other people around, etc. Those are the non-linguistic components of the context. We design those. We keep them in mind. Well, what we did not get to, and what I wanted to cover briefly here, are maintaining factors. Another consideration, another set of information that guides procedure planning. So I would like to augment the procedure, or move a bit ahead here by covering maintaining factors, reviewing them for you. Now, maintaining factors are behavioral systems. They're non-linguistic behavioral systems that influence speech and language. And they are cognition, the sensory motor system, affect and emotion, or the psychosocial system, and medical issues. Now, what I'd simply like to do is give you an overview. I know you've had this material in other courses. Again, a course on intervention planning is really asking you to bring to bear, when we enter the problem space of a client who needs support from us, intervention, we bring our knowledge to bear to generate goals and procedures. So I'd like to quickly review this material with you from my perspective too, so you have a better insight as to what I'm thinking. So cognition, what do I think about when I think about cognition? I think about it as consciousness or awareness, and where awareness counts, by the way, what individuals are aware of. So where awareness is directed during problem solving, what are the objects of the individual's awareness, and what types of, again, relationships and transformations are being made among the objects of awareness. And again, I tend to, as I've explained, I think in class, I identify myself as being a constructivist, very influenced by Piaget, also, of course, very influenced by Chomsky. So these are, again, our mental representations. These are mental objects that we are always focused on when we're aware of things. It's what we've constructed in our mind that we're projecting out there in the world, or that we're using whatever's out there to project upon, you see. So that's what a cognition is about, what's in our mind as we project. It's also about metalinguistic and executive processing. That is another angle on cognition, information processing angle, particularly executive processes. And reasoning is also part of cognition. Inferential reasoning, syllogistic reasoning, all syllogistic reasoning, by the way, is something along the lines of, just to remind you, All all painters wear hats. That man is wearing a hat. He's a painter, true or false? Or she's a painter, true or false? Following me? Deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Just reminding you about these things. Now, cognition is assessed. One way it's assessed is in context of Piagetian problem-solving tasks. When we're thinking about the Piagetian structures, the Piagetian problem-solving tasks illustrate goal-directed behavior, problem solving, problem identification, problem solving, and they give us an opportunity to look at the focus of awareness of the individual, discovery process, discovery having to do with what the person becomes aware of and focuses on in the context of problem solving, ultimately what they represent. And this influence of awareness, of course, is absolutely reflected in language, content, form interactions. These things become the content of mind in a problem-solving task. And problem-solving tasks are very nice contexts for targeting language. And this, again, this conversation I'm having with you, or you call this a conversation or a one-sided lecture, I guess, of course. The creation of problem-solving tasks. This is part of procedure planning, potentially. We are talking about procedure planning. What influences it? What sources of information gives us ideas when we're planning procedures for clients. So I'm going to show you a couple of clips from videos of children who are engaged in tasks that I identify as being Piagetian. Some of this Axel task, I'm not sure I've shown that, but I will show a clip of it with my son involved in it. I will also show you a clip subsequently of a bead task and a clip of a nobody ever did the Hanoi Tower yet in class, right? The Tower of Hanoi, because I'm so short on time. I love to play around with these things. So you will see my kids doing the 3-disc Hanoi Tower. I'll use those 3 little clips to illustrate Piagetian type tasks. And as we talk about cognition and the kinds of tasks that we could create in therapy. Goals for themselves and solve problems for themselves without adult interference or instruction. And this was one of the several children that I looked at. This will be an excerpt from this.
That one just before that one's going, we'll just point to pick up. What you're going to do, I'm going to give you this. You're going to roll that axle down this incline. I'll call that an incline or a hill. I'm putting this up here. And your job is to make that, knock that down. Away in this direction. Again, same thing to do. Same goal, and that is to take the axle, roll it down the incline, and knock down that particular little tower I put there. The green tower. Okay? Anytime you're ready.
Oopsie.
Okay, now we're going to keep going here. You can take that, do anything you need to knock down that tower. Move it around in there. I'll get it. Here we go. Again, you can move that around any way you want. Any way you want. Yes. This or that. The only thing I need that distance to stay the same. Any of the material you want.
Oh, yeah, this is not good.
You can put that any place you want. Yes, good. Okay. Get it on the timeline. It's cheating a little bit because it's bouncing down. Put it there. Will this work?
Yep.
You have to let it roll freely. You can't throw it. That'd be cheating. Again, you can adjust that. You can adjust this any place you need to move through it to get this to fall down. This can go anywhere that can go. There you go. Perfect. If I could, here, tell me what to do.
To knock it down.
Yeah. Where to put?
Right, lemon, yeah, good.
Okay.
So try again.
Yep. Okay, very good. Here. Now where should I put it?
It's the same place.
What if I make you do it this way? Here. Keep it exactly the way I gave it to you. Gonna work?
Can I do it like this?
Yes.
Yeah, no. Can I flip this
Why is
around?
that? Yeah, you can flip it any way you want.
Because the weight's different. So.
Wait. There you go. So if I give it to you this way, where should I put this?
This one, put it here.
And if I give it to you this way, which way to go? Why is that?
The weight on this block
Yeah.
is more greater than
Okay.
this.
Very good. Time we're going to go in this direction.
Hi everybody again. This is my son Cameron. Cameron is, what are you, 11 now?
Yeah.
11 years old, okay, in 6th grade. Okay, this is the 3-disc Hanoi Tower, or Tower of Hanoi. The whole idea is you have to get these 3 circles in the same order over here to this particular post, to this pencil here. You can only move one at a time, and you cannot put a big one on a small one, but you can put a small one on a big one. You can go this way, you can go this way when you move, it doesn't matter. The idea is to get all 3 on here in the fewest moves that you can do it in. Okay?
Am I
Get it?
competing against anyone?
No, just you.
Okay, good.
You're just doing it. No competition. Okay.
Oh, I got it. Got it.
Very good. Hooray.
I did it.
There you go. Excellent. Wait, don't leave. I'm going to do it one more time, but this time get them on the middle. On one at a time. Start there. Now start from where you're at.
So
Yeah. Whoa.
So what am I supposed to do now?
The same thing, but this time start there and get them in the middle. Make them end up in the middle.
Okay. Oh.
You can start again if you want, or keep going from there.
I'm gonna keep going from here. What did I do?
Very good. Hooray. Okay, one more. Get.
Okay.
I want them to bend up back here again now.
Starting from here.
From the middle, right from where they are. What's your first? You have no. When you're ready to move the first one, tell me why. What you're gonna do and why. Like, what's your first move gonna be?
This
Yeah.
is gonna go here. So
Why
I can
is
move
that?
it out of the way
Yeah.
to get this over here.
Okay.
So then I'm gonna move this here,
Yeah.
and then I'll get this here,
Mm.
this on the other side, this on top of it, this over here, and then I can put this
Excellent.
here so I can put this
Yeah.
there and
Okay.
that there.
Now you give me advice. If I'm gonna do it now, I want to end up in the middle. What should I do first, and why should I
Put
do
the
it?
smallest string here,
Why?
so you could put this over here to free this up to end up getting it here somehow. That's my best explanation.
Okay. Here.
Yes.
Then move this here.
Yes.
And move this back here.
Yes. Actually, never mind. Never mind.
Let's start again.
Yeah.
What's my first move and why?
So you're supposed to get it here.
Yeah, I want to end up there.
Move this here.
Why here?
So I can free up space to put something here in the end. Then this here.
Uh-huh.
I knew you would.
Yeah. The way the camera's working, yeah.
And then
And
put
I'll do it.
this over here.
Okay.
And then put this over here.
Right. I get it. Did
That on
this
top of here.
right? Yeah. Okay.
That
Very good.
there.
You can
This
move it.
here.
You
And
can
then
finish it
that
up
on
for me.
top.
Okay.
Can I do mine?
Yeah. 1 second. Very good. Very good.
How many moves is that?
I didn't go.
A lot though, right?
Not too bad.
Probably.
What's the best first move? What do you think now? Best first
To
move.
get it here or here?
Yeah, which is the best place to go?
To
And why?
make it go where?
To do it in fewest moves possible. I want this to be in the middle.
You would have to put this over here.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, this is how I
Okay, now this is
Wait,
my.
Dad, can I have ice cream?
Where is it upstairs? Right.
No, it's downstairs.
There's two of them in the one upstairs.
Okay, bye
I
bye.
think.
Alright,
Wait a second. Let me introduce you. This is my
bye.
This is son number 2. This is Jordan, 12 years old. Okay, I want to get all these 3 discs
I
over
know
to
how
the
to do
end
it.
thing now.
Orange over here. Let's drop it. Green here. Orange over here. Black over here. Orange over here. Green here.
Okay, very good.
Orange.
Can't do any faster than that. Right. Now,
You can't go faster.
in the middle, I want you to take it from here and make them be piled up here now.
What are you trying to prove here? Can I think this
In
out?
the same
Can I think this
the
out?
fewest number of moves.
Alright.
Yeah, you can take it out, of course.
Got it. I don't know.
Got it.
Let me just think. Let's make. Yeah, I got it.
Okay, very good. Yep, you got it. One more move. I want these now to end up over here. But before you go first, you tell me what's your first move and why. What's the first move and why?
The best first move is to
Yeah, I
put
want
this
the best
either
first move.
this either here or there.
What-
It doesn't really matter.
Does it matter?
No, not in my opinion.
Okay, go.
So actually, yes, it does matter. I'm gonna put
Does
it.
it matter?
It does matter.
Why?
Because if you put this here
Yeah.
and then you put this over here, you'd have to like rearrange things a lot, and then you just be like stuck there. And I can't. I'm not good at explaining things. This goes there. This goes over here. This goes here. This goes up here. This is gonna fall off the table.
Oh.
It goes here and then this goes there.
Would you want to try to 5 this one? I'm just going to make it this to there.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, 5 discs though. 5.
Let's take the small. I'm
I'm
gonna
not
go with
gonna
my
say
original.
anything.
What I
Just do it.
normally do. I'm gonna go what I normally do. That, right? Now I'm starting to. I'm thinking. I don't know. Five discs is so hard. I don't know.
Yeah, no, this is the 5 discs is a very advanced one now.
I don't know what I'm doing. This is so confusing. Oh, Jesus. Oh, Jesus. No, I can't. I can't, because now look, I can't.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I can't really do anything now.
Why?
I'm back where I started.
No.
I'm not getting anywhere.
Remember, you have to get this one over there.
I know.
So you had this over here. Now you're not getting anywhere?
No, there's nothing I can do. I mean, I could... Voila. I exactly.
Well, I want to.
I know.
You're allowed to jump across. You're allowed to jump across. Well, no. Just leave it there. You can hop.
What do you mean I can hop?
You can hop the black one.
Oh, yeah. I didn't see that.
No,
I didn't see that.
that's weird.
Ooh. Wait, what? No. Then the green one.
Yeah.
This is taking a long time.
Well, there's a lot of discs.
I need to get the green one. There, green. Green done. Now it's going to be a lot easier.
Stop and tell me what your next move is going to be and why.
This is going to go here, because with my original thing that I did last time.
Oh, now you're back to 3.
Yeah. Wait, I want to maybe put this here, because I'm, yeah.
Very good. So you saw everything. Very good.
Did
There
I?
you go. Yes, you did.
Yes, I
course you
did.
Very good.
Just get off. Get off. There.
Yeah.
That took a long time.
Excellent. Okay.
How can I see you do it?
Can you see me do it?
Maybe
Well, I
after
could
you're
have
done
you do it
filming?
again.
When you're done filming? Can you do it?
I'll do it right now while I'm filming. Let's see if I can do it. Okay. Let's
I wanna
see
see
what
how
I do.
smart
What's
my
the best
father is.
move? Well, I want everybody who watches this to
Follow along at home.
do it. You are assigned to make a Tower of Hanoi and practice the task, okay?
What are you doing?
Let's see if I can do it. I'm showing you how to do it.
Oh my god, what? It's not fair.
However, when you
I see.
practice it, please do not use my tape. In fact, I'm only going to go this far, just to show you that
Yeah, oh wow, that's awesome.
I can probably do it.
I don't think you can do it. No, but now you have to do the black one.
Well, it jumps. Get it?
Okay.
I would do it, but I'm asking everybody to do it themselves without me doing it, just to get at first of all, an experience that is a very, very popular in the psych literature. This is a very popular task. And it's one of the tasks that Piaget himself studied in his equilibration research. He talks about, well, actually it was not Piaget, it was Boissier with kids with learning disabilities, and I'm blanking on the name of the guy who did the research of French. It was in France and Switzerland that the original research was done with the Tower of Hanoi on Piagetian stages that individuals go through when they learn to solve the task. You try, everybody, and then we'll talk about it. I'm going to put it on stop. What you saw was that first task, the Axel task. Where was the child? I hope you recall. I hope recall, or I ask you, where was the child's attention, awareness being challenged, or what were the areas that needed to be attended to in order to get the highest level of outcome here? The highest best procedure, best causal explanation, an operational one, by the way. And well, you had attention being drawn from the ramp to the target, so that was 2 points of 2 awareness focuses, right? Ramp, target. And then what I did was replaced one of the wheels. The 2 wheels in the first clip were symmetric; they were the same size. But what I did was put a larger wheel on, swapped the equivalent size wheel for a larger wheel on one side, whereas the other side of the wheel stayed the same. And that I did that secretly. That caused the axle to veer. And then the child's attention is drawn not only to from the ramp to the target, but also to the 2 wheels, right? And to attributes of the wheels, and to attributes, and the process by which he or subjects become aware of these attributes is a discovery process. It's a discovery process supported by the feedback that the individual gets as they explore the object further, particularly when they make errors, when their efforts don't succeed. They're compelled to reflect and look, touch, feel, etc. Get information from the task to construct mental representations. And that is the process by which discovery takes place, because nothing exists out in the world until we've represented something to go along with it that can be projected upon it, which becomes, of course, the basis for content of mind. Well, in any event, that was and then the key individuals, by the way, go through stages from this point of view of cognition, so we don't have a right or wrong answer. His idea, by the way, about why the wheels veered was that the weight was different on the 2 sides. One was heavier. Well, that's a standard response in this particular task, and I wonder what you believe causes the veering to take place. Is it the different weight of the larger wheel to the smaller wheel? The smaller wheel in this case was also, I had used a wider wheel, which usually kids and adults, by the way, I do this with college students, adults feel that it's really the smaller wheel, it's really heavier, and it's holding the whole thing back, and so it veers. Now, do you agree with that, or do you think it may be something else? There's something else, another variable here that leads to the behavior. Well, think about that. Then the second child that you looked at, I gave you a clip from a child who was doing beads, and I don't remember if in class I showed that to you. I think I did when I was talking about constructivism. But that was an early research project that I did with children who with Down syndrome, 3.5-year-olds. To investigate whether these kids themselves set goals for themselves, identify and try to solve problems. And as you can see from that little clip, yes, they did, and yes, they do. And there are things to discover there too. There's also what was drawing in popping beads together. Well, what does this child, in terms of focus of awareness, have to consider? Well, there's the beads, of course, the 2 beads. So that's, again, by the way, all of this stuff is relational. I hope you see that. Relationships between things. So this constructivist Piagetian problem-solving context very much goes along with this whole idea that mental representations are relational in nature, and that language is relational in nature, that developmental things are always relational in nature, that generative things are relational in nature. Well, in any event, there was the 2 beads, but then there was the attributes of the beads, not just the holes, but the part of the whole. That is, one had a hole in it. One, you have to line up a nipple to a receptacle, which was challenging. I think you saw that clip where the child was challenged by that. Early on, it seemed he had figured all that out, but he was ultimately challenged by that. And then, and there were other things too. Hand position. If his hands were too far away from the point of connection, the beads were very unstable. And by the way, the child illustrates hypotonicity, a sensory motor maintaining factor we're getting to in a moment. So that was the bead task, which, by the way, the child engaged in completely spontaneously, but it nevertheless contains aspects of Piagetian type problem-solving tasks. Why? Because the Piagetian tasks are designed themselves to just represent the real world in one way or another, among other things. I'm oversimplifying a bit here. And in any event, on the Tower of Hanoi task, by the way, the 3-disc task, well, and I would love to work with you on the 5-disc task. That would be more fun. That too challenged the children because they had to make relationships between discs based on size order, on restrictions that were placed upon them. Right? No big ones on small ones. Only small ones on big ones. All discs had to be on the posts simultaneously. You can only move one at a time, etc., etc. Well, what we have in the, I want to draw your attention to this, and that is, these are tables that I've reproduced here from the textbook, the Klein and the Moses and Klein book that we have chapters up for you for. And what you see there, if you can see this, is, if I can see this, in the reproduction, and I'm afraid to make it bigger because I'm going to mess up the screen, are what we provide for you are stages of linguistic performance and cognitive skills or competencies that correspond to the stages. For example, reduplicated and variegated babbling in a pre-linguistic stage of speech development is very much associated with circular reactions, the child noticing their behavior and repeating things over and over again, one way or another. And so we show that these cognitive skills are related to stages of linguistic performance, and that has implications for intervention planning, both for goals. These corresponding linguistic and cognitive stages give you some direction potentially for goal setting. For example, if you're working with an infant or a child who is nonverbal, who is maybe a toddler or older, well, you could focus on pre-speech sound production and object manipulation. But it not only these cognitive skills have primary implications for procedure planning. And we give you the references for these. Encourage caregiver-child interactions and extend vocalizations and object manipulation. I cannot possibly teach this at this point. I'm pointing this out. Intentional means-end behavior, which occurs at about 6 to 8 months, and corresponds with intentional communication, which I should have put under stage of linguistic performance. Intentional communication, I think it's reflected here in the implications for intervention planning. Under goals, intentional communicative functions emerge at this time. Instrumental, regulatory, interactional, using the Halliday framework, taxonomy. Dorr has a taxonomy. Seema Gerber has a taxonomy of these intentional communication functions. Leahy, I believe, has one as well. And they can be goals. And you can create procedures that encourage this sort of thing, which involve the manipulation of objects, etc. Well, this goes through single words to two words combinations, the corresponding cognitive achievements, multi-scheme pretend play, script play, in other words, pretend play, part-whole relations, conservation at the Piagetian stage level we go to, metalinguistics, which is a cognitive thing, metalinguistics, awareness of speech and language units that can be manipulated, or metaphonology. Phonologic awareness, right? Awareness. Anytime we're dealing with awareness, we're in the domain of cognition, because language, what I'm doing, we are aware. We're aware of our topic or content, maybe of our objective for talking, but not of the syntax or phonology or anything like that, unless you're a speech-language pathologist. Well, each of these things have implications for goals. Each of these achievements in the cognitive domain has implications for goal setting and procedure planning. So I encourage you to look through this table for ideas about goal setting and procedure planning, certainly in cases of language delay or rehabilitation, by the way, as well, particularly when you get to the level of conservation and operational thinking, which is quite relevant, again, for the LC client that we're following. Finally, to, again, the literacy level of awareness of speech and language and the various goals that now that we're moving, our field is very active in the area of literacy. Well, we have a whole group of targets, including ultimately reading. That's one point of view about cognition. Another, it's not a point, it's one aspect of cognition, the Piagetian aspect. Cognition also includes, again, as I mentioned, levels of processing, particularly sensory motor level of processing in the cognitive domain, in which we do things but we're not aware. And the executive level of processing in which we use language, internal language, that talk in our head to suppress interfering behaviors and direct ourselves, to regulate our problem-solving behaviors. Executive functions, just to remind you from the the lectures on the material on paradigms that direct procedure planning. Just to review this, because this is so important. That cognition also includes executive function, the appropriation of language for controlling and guiding academic performance. Scripts and routines, which develop over time and are shaped across different contexts. And I illustrated, yes, I'm going to give you a link here. I'm going to show you a clip of a video here where my son, again, I may have mentioned to you, this cost me money, so you have to watch this, since if I engage my son in illustrative tasks, he charges me. So this cost me probably 20 bucks. So in any event, he is a small clip of him responding to a component of the Self-5 following directions, which I'm sure I mentioned in class, and I may have shown this already, that the Self-5 is very much, many of the subtests, particularly following directions and sentence construction subtests, are meta executive function assessments. They're at that executive function processing level. So let's take a look. Point to a circle and a square before you point to the X in the triangle. Go. See? Okay. Now we go to number 20. Before you point to the little black X and the big black X, point to the little white circle. Go. Okay, very good. Now we should be on 21. Before, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before pointing to the last square, point to the first circle and the first X. Go. We'll do 2 more, okay?
Okay.
We are on 22?
I agree.
Yes, very good too. 22. Before pointing to the last circle, point to the first triangle and the first square. Go. Okay, we're going to do 1 more. Number 23. Listen carefully. Before you point to the square on the left side of the circle, point to the triangle and the X. Go. Okay. Okay, the final maintaining factor I'm going to speak about now, although there are others, including psychosocial issues which we need to address, and medical issues, but the last one I want to talk about in this lecture set today is sensory motor function as a maintaining factor. And again, in creating procedures, designing procedures for clients addressing long and short term and session goals, we have to consider sensory motor function, both in terms of what we can expect the client to achieve, but also on how we design procedures to incorporate or address sensory motor issues, which is addressed at the context level. Sensory motor's function, except perhaps in the area of articulation, is not typically a goal, but a procedure or the context in a session goal in which the behavioral target is achieved. So I want to just point out to you those aspects of sensory motor function that I pay attention to. Now I know we're speech language pathologists, and we typically look first at the mouth of the client and focus on oral motor function and the oral peripheral speech mechanism. However, when and perhaps this is because my background clinically is work with children with moderate to profound developmental disabilities, I tend to focus first on the entire child and on locomotion. And in fact on the following factors actually. Tonicity, which refers to muscle coordination. And you're familiar with typical tonicity, high tonicity or hypertonicity, and hypo or low tonicity. Again, this is unfortunately not the place for me to teach this material, but to remind you that the information you have gathered or garnered over your years as a student or in your experience, clinically or otherwise, is now brought to bear on intervention planning, and this business is typically brought to bear on procedure planning. So tonicity, body segmentation, coordination, and stability. Meaning, body segmentation, how the individual can use individual parts of the body independently of other parts of the body. In cases such as cerebral palsy, certain types of cerebral palsy, body segmentation is affected. So therefore, when the client perhaps moves their arm to reach for something, their entire body is engaged, including their mouth, their tongue. That perhaps they go into high tone, and that's not only their extremities, but their oral mechanism, and in fact the rest of their body, or whatever components of the body are involved simultaneously. Obviously, that's going to interfere with speech function. And by the way, the word is sensory motor, not motor, not sensory by itself, but sensory motor. That's because movement involves sensation, and there's no sensation without movement. Sensation, the primary function of sensation, really is to gather feedback from movement and facilitate representation of sensory motor actions. So body segmentation, I take a look at, I keep an eye on, I evaluate. Coordination, the ability to take then separate parts of the body. For example, I move this hand, this finger, and I can in fact move my index finger, but not my thumb, or I can move them together. Thus I have a radial grasp, or I can move my middle finger separately from my thumb, so I can get, I'm having trouble putting this on camera, a neat pincer, right, etc., etc. In any event, coordination and body stability, and by body stability I mean the ability to maintain self, the client's ability and our ability to maintain self in a speech posture. What are speech postures? They're the positions our body is in when we speak. I'm in a sitting position, that's one speech posture. If I had a camera that was mobile, I'd stand up just to illustrate another speech posture that we're also familiar with, standing. Other speech postures are prone prop, side sitting, W sitting on the floor, not W sitting, but let's call it Indian sitting on the floor. These are typical speech postures that we take, that our children take, our clients take, etc. If we're not stable in a speech posture, our bodies will be doing a lot of work to stabilize ourselves. And that work will take away from the ability, in fact, from the segmentation of the oral motor speech mechanism, for the ability for that to operate independently of the rest of the body. And it's absolutely necessary for the speech mechanism to operate independently from the rest of the body. It really isn't independently, because the rest of the body is in fact supporting speech movement, which is why I look at the entire body. So what I'm saying really isn't true. But it is the fact that the rest of the body can be still, or even doing something else. Like I can be talking and writing at the same time, or sewing, or typing on the computer, or having a drink, or whatever. And my mouth will move and not be affected by the actions of other parts of my body. Locomotion, movement, that's important to look at. Also, we should be able to speak while moving. That very much affects the ability to explore, to manipulate all of this, by the way, influences content, form, and use. Content, because sensory motor function through feedback and relationship making contributes to mental representation and the internalization of the world, necessary for content of mind and language content. Form, articulation, syntax, etc. are the movements to support these things, including respiration for speech. Requires typical functional sensory motor function, and pragmatically, human contact has to be comfortable and responsive, and that's interfered with that's potentially interfered with when there is sensory motor involvement. For all of these reasons, we have to keep in mind the need to address sensory motor issues, typically in collaboration, incidentally, with our colleagues whose job it is to address sensory motor function, OTs and PTs in particular. So we are interested in locomotion and the ability, of course, to, as I said, the word is sensory motor. So the ability to process feedback from adaptive goal-directed behavior, process feedback, get information from our goal-directed actions, our goal-direction relationship-making actions. And of course, all of this contributes to oral motor function, and as I said initially, speech-language pathologists usually zone in on oral motor function, and I would like to put that in context of the functioning of the rest of the body, which I believe we should be interested in, although that may not be our primary, that is not in fact our primary area of expertise or the scope of our profession, but unless we're neurodevelopmentally certified or certified in sensory integration. Now in the textbook, the Moses and Klein textbook, you will see another chart. Remember, in the cognitive part, I pointed out a chart that identified speech language stages or phases, corresponding cognitive phases, skills and competencies, and how they contribute to goals and procedures. Well, here in this chart, we do something quite similar. We focus on sensory motor functions in column 1, implications for intervention planning in terms of goal and procedure planning, and the evidence with reference to the literature.
God only knows how old it is.
It's honest. Here's my overview myself. Quite a few things changed. Well, right now it's Christmas. So I'm home months for people. And I love it. It's nice to be with my